friends. Welcome to another episode of the 10 Laws Podcast with East Forest. I'm East Forest. Welcome to this episode. We have a great conversation with my new friend, Luke Howard. And he's a musician. And if you don't know him, I highly recommend you check him out. I wanted to reach out because I'm really into his music. He's in Australia, and he makes some really stirring contemporary classical music that I admire. So, like a lot of these musicians that I admire, it's always an honor for me to reach out and get a chance to talk about process and, what he's going through. And just, we recorded this one also quite a while ago. So let's just leave it at that. It was a while ago. So there's no current events that you're going to hear about in this one. And that's okay, because, man, is there a lot going on for all of us in our current events around us. It's been another wild week. Pick your pleasure on what was wild for you. The crucible of incarnation continues to spin, and the fire gets quite a bit hotter. I hope you are doing what you can to keep your head on straight, but more importantly, to stay centered in your heart. We're all a bunch of brave souls who have incarnated into this extremely intense time, and I think we got more to do. We got more work to do, but you can do it. I actually created a new playlist over on Spotify that's called Music for the Inner Warrior. And I like thinking about us cultivating our skill sets, our inner skills, as opposed to, we need to get new armor or put on thicker armor. And this is about becoming more skillful internally and how we can use that to walk our walk. And we have to. So you can go check that out. That's over on Spotify. It's kind of my own curation of tracks from the East Forest catalog into the back catalog, and some new and some old. I've got a few more of those sorts of playlists in there too if you want to check out the others. On July 18th, I'm thinking out loud about doing another live stream ceremony, medicine ceremony event. So if you want me to, give me a little encouragement. team@eastforest.org, or on social media. Just tag East Forest at East Forest on Instagram, or at East Forest Music on Facebook. Same on Twitter. Let me know what you think. Are you into that? Do you need that? Are you feeling like you don't need that? I'm in this weird predicament that I have a sensation that a lot of people are going through, where motivations. It's almost like we're in winter and you really feel like you need a rest, and it's when everything's being pushed aside and rescheduled. It's hard to put on the hat of okay, I'm going to mount some events, even if they're online. But there's a glimmer inside me that I try to listen to, and it's starting to tell me that I think this should happen this month, a few days before my birthday too. So it feels like there's some kind of alignment there. And I'd love to hear from you. If you feel like you're into having another live stream ceremony event, let me know. I'll do my best to dredge up the courage and the wherewithal to get prepared. It takes a lot out of me to get ready for those things and to do them. But I'm here if it's of service. The Music for Mushrooms album, which is sort of like the flagship music offering for ceremony work, is available in high resolution now on a thumb drive. So, of course, you can listen to it on Spotify and things like that, Apple Music in full, and you can download it off of Bandcamp, and you can get it in high res there too. But the 24-bit version, which is massive and is as high resolution as it gets, only fits on things like a flash drive as opposed to CDs, or certainly not vinyl. It'd be like a 10 vinyl set. So if you want to order that, there's a limited edition printing of these little thumb drives, and you can get that over at eastforest.org. And thank you so much for the reviews for the podcast. Please continue to do that. It really helps. If you've done it already, I think you can do it again. But even better is when you share it online, and then I get to see it too, and others get to see it, and it's a fun way to keep the conversation going about the old cast. I've got some other things I'm going to be able to tell you about really soon that I've been working on in the background for quite some time, but it's not quite yet the time. But what you can do to help me get those things over the finish line is just like send me some good juju. Keep listening to the music that helps keep things look nice and active. I'm trying to get some partnerships going that I think could really help expand our community and our mission. So yeah, just thanks for the good vibes. It's just been such a wild time. I've been really I feel like I've been productive, but it's just like I haven't seen a lot of people, and I haven't seen my parents in a long time, and I'm, all the stuff we're all going through, and the intensity of the social change we're feeling, and I know you're feeling it too. So from me to you, it's just saying hang in there. But for now, let's dig into the beauty of creativity and honoring music and how it's made, and dig under the hood a little bit and introduce you to this wonderful artist. Let's get into this conversation with our friend, Luke Howard. So tell me why you said that you didn't think the music that you make is as popular in America or maybe even in Australia, but I'm assuming you have a lot of work in Europe, I've heard you say. First off, what is the music that you make? Because I often run into a problem. I have a lot of crossover to the kind of worlds you're in, not exactly the same, but my elevator pitch, even after 10 years, is terrible. Like every time,
me too.
Anytime someone asks, even to this day, you'd think I could just be like, oh, it's instrumental music, or I just make something up, or I still struggle and say, well, it's a bit of this, it's a bit of that.
I'm
the same. What kind of world do you feel you float in?
I mean, years ago, before I even got onto this kind of modern classical train, so there you go, that's one way of describing it. But of course, modern classical encompasses everything from Max Richter to Philip Glass, and whilst there's a lot in common between those two guys, there's a very different audience as well, I think. But years ago when I was in a more kind of Daniel Lanois-influenced ambient sort of pedal steely kind of band, my friend described it as music for a film without the film, and I reckon that's a pretty nice way of describing it. But otherwise, it's instrumental music. Instrumental music that's sort of melodic and accessible, but is also, has some kind of enough lyrical content to not just be background music, even though it can be, it's part of its popularity, let's be honest, is probably due to playlists and its success as background music.
Yeah, I often feel, though, like most contemporary classical music that's popular is actually I think it's quite good. Like a lot of it, to me, where some genres of music, I don't know, some of the stuff that rises to the top, I often feel like I'm not that interested. I don't feel like it's always the best music.
Whereas it probably depends who you ask too, because like there's a lot of stuff in playlists that I don't think is incredibly interesting.
I guess I don't know about the playlist, but at least as far as the people that I consider like really great in this field, and you one of them, I'm like, it's pretty solid. I think now look, the music might be like simplistic compared to some other music. Mine certainly is, but that's not what I'm talking about. It's mean like, wow, that's they just nailed it. There's a lot of inventiveness, I think, going on in some contemporary classical music with mixing and just sort of sounds and just taking genres that's kind of stale like classical music and just saying like, we'll do whatever, we'll bring in whatever we want. And that's why I think it sort of defies genre at times.
Yeah, and I reckon you're right. The good stuff, the stuff that rises to the top, obviously it's subjective, but, the big guys, Niels and Max and Johan, and that stuff is really as interesting as it is compositionally. There's a lot of care that's gone into the production of it, and I think that's something that probably, I reckon that sort of, I don't know if it separates it, but that's possibly one of the distinguishing factors from, say, more documentary style classical recordings. But then if you look at a record label like ECM, maybe that was less about the composer-producer. I feel like these days a lot of the production is generally done by the composer as well. But a focus on great sonics has been something that's existed. Maybe as a niche, like in the recording industry, for a very long time.
Yeah, and I hear that in your work a lot. I mean, I'm assuming I'm correct that you put a lot of time and energy into the sound quality whether it's recording real instruments, you spend more money than you probably would need to, because a lot of people would use soft synths or
I'm not going to. I mean,
I hear a lot of real strings and real pianos and all sorts of things in your stuff.
I never use sample. I mean, I would use samples sometimes to, as my friend calls it, there's a bit of cornflour just to thicken strings up, particularly if it's a film and you need a slightly more epic vibe than your budget allows for. But I decided long ago that I wasn't going to go down that route. I mean, firstly, my background is like playing music, it's a real social, organic kind of thing.
What did you start playing? What is that background that brought you to where you are?
It's like a lot of people, classical piano as a kid, and then I got pretty deep into jazz in my 20s. That's what I studied at university. And, spent a lot of time transcribing Bud Powell and Keith Jarrett. Wow. And I mean, I don't know if I transcribed much Keith, but I certainly overdosed on listening to him and Brad Meldau, the sort of two titans.
Keith is my dude, man. Yeah. I mean,
I've been getting back into him, actually. It's like it's one of those things where I just overdose so much on everything Keith, like American
it's
Quartet,
pretty wide.
European Quartet, solo, the Standards Trio, some of the more obscure stuff that then I almost didn't listen to him for 10 years. So now I've been going back and realizing, not only how amazing and deep it is, but also that having I guess tried to, I could summarize it as sort of a bit of that classic sort of thesis, antithesis, synthesis kind of thing, right? Whereas like, firstly, I wanted to be like Keith, and then I was like, okay, I can't do this. Let's strip everything out and play, just find the most essential part of music. I wouldn't say let's just play arpeggios, but let's try and find the most simplest expression, because Keith is he's kind of a maximalist. I mean,
he can play anything. Yeah.
He can play anything, and some of his stuff is so harmonically. He can play very beautifully, but there's a lot of information density in there. And now I'm kind of like, okay, I've been working the arpeggios for the last 10 years. How can I bring some of that back into some of that sort of dissonance and complexity back into a way that's honest, back into the music in a way that's honest and true to my kind of musical, North Star or whatever, but also is, it creates a little more complexity. I feel like I've been afforded this unique opportunity to have an audience, and maybe I can, without wanting to sound too preachy about it, but take them on a journey like that brings in a bit more of the complexity and the stuff that I loved about people like Jarrett.
Okay, well, I want to ask you about this because I'm really interested in this in my own process. Like, I have a feeling, especially if your background is jazz, that your technique. Yeah, I always feel like when people get better and better with their technique, it's sort of like this linear curve of them flexing what they can do in a sense. And you're making choices at times in your music to bring simplicity back. And you were speaking to that, like there was some kind of process where you wanted to bring it back to some kind of core. But that's a clear choice that you're making, and one that not everyone naturally makes. So what is that North Star that's leading you to make that choice to simplicity? Like, what's the value of it?
It's such a great question, because you're totally right. And I feel with the sort of institutionalization of jazz as a kind of taught art, that jazz is quite teachable, because, I mean, you can't teach taste, but you can teach people all of the modes of the melodic minor. And, it's like, it's very easy to get caught up in it, because it's interesting. And if you have a sort of technically oriented mind, and it's very addictive. But it doesn't force you to confront the sort of more intuitive and emotional aspects of music. And there's definitely a danger when you have the technique that you will use it. I mean, everyone has a different journey on how their technique versus taste balance works out, right? Like, if you have no technique, and I certainly have less technique now than I used to, because I don't practice the piano a lot. If you have no technique, then maybe that can be a blessing, right? Because you're you won't
That's like
be
me.
Yeah. But I mean, of course, then the danger now, which is what I find, is like, when your technique's limited, your ideas, if you come to composition as an improviser, then your ideas can be limited by your technique as well.
Yes.
I think, it's one of those things too, where it's like, I can see that I was always on this journey, but it took me maybe 10 years to really actually get there. Like, I had plenty of moments post-finishing university where I was like all practiced up. I wasn't Keith or Brad, but, I had some chops, but I didn't have any gigs and I didn't have any ideas that were like, that manifested in that form that were kind of authentically mine. And I've got a couple of memories of just sitting at home being like, all right, okay, got the chops, the phone's not ringing, what am I going to do? And
finding your voice there, yeah.
Yeah, it took a while to like kind of come to a place of having some taste, that's probably part of it, but also acknowledging that I would say the jazz education, whilst incredibly useful in developing a sense of harmony and all of the fundamental kind of things, that it was almost a bit of a detour from the kind of music that I have an affinity with. And when I was living in Berlin about 10 years ago and didn't have any gigs because I didn't know anyone, and I was kind of like, all right, what am I going to do? Keep practicing and, try and be like, ingest the complexity of Keith, or maybe there's something else to do. And that was just one of those weird things where once that space was created, somehow I discovered the music of, peers or greats or whatever, the music that we were talking about before in this minimalist post-classical world. And I was like, hey, this music's really beautiful and it sounds really authentic and it's simple, but it's not simple in a kind of treating the listener as if they're an intelligent way. And maybe this is a path I can kind of explore. And so I was super influenced by that music. And, I reckon it takes 3, 5, 10 years for a musical language to be absorbed. And I guess that sort of got me back on a path,
Don't you think that's like it's sort of a razor to edge to ride, where it's simplistic, but you said it's not talking down to the listener? I think that's what you said. And that really is it, because I feel like a lot of times with the music that I'm trying to make, I'm always trying to find that edge, and it's where, well, I often don't want it to go in a place where it feels like it's, too saccharine, or it's like, oh, that's too on the nose. It's too on the nose for me, for my taste. But I don't want it to be too far in a direction that it's like it loses that emotional core, because I really like to find a certain kind of like emotional cultivation. Like, there's a certain feeling that I feel.
Yeah, totally. I feel like
that's what I want the most.
Summarize it as like emotional without being sentimental. That's kind of
perfect
the vibe.
Yes.
And I feel like, and of course, everyone has a different compass with respect to this. Like, if you talk to
ours is right, yeah.
Yeah, but ours is right. If you talk to a recent classical music graduate and you play them some of this music, whilst ironically they'll probably like really dig Radiohead when they're off the clock, if you play them some kind of this music that somehow sits in between popular and classical music, they will be like, oh yeah. Well, it's not really, it's a bit cheesy, or it's not really classical music or whatever. Or I like, what did I had someone play on the track the other day, and they had, oh no, maybe there was someone I went on a date with. They'd heard of Max Richter, but they knew of him because of some of his music was used in an ad or something. But it's not a world that they sort of inhabit, and often they'll part of, I guess, defending your own territory. I mean, jazz. I feel like the more obscure the music, not that classical music is obscure, but like people that are in a world of, say, like a protected world, like classical or jazz is. It's kind of like it's no longer the popular music it was 50 or 100 years ago. Often have a complicated relationship with variants of that music that does seem to be attracting a wider audience. They kind of want the accessibility but they don't want to kind of open up their like enclave too much.
I wonder if country music fans feel the same way, in the way that it's getting hip hop elements brought into it. And it's like, wait a minute.
I'm sure, yeah.
How dare you? Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I'm not doing it to like, I'm not doing it because I want to sell records. Well, I mean, I'm not selling a lot of actual records, but I'm doing it because
it's the music you make.
It's the music I make. Yeah. Look, and there are definitely times where I'm like, okay, have I sailed too close to the sun here? Like how do I get that balance? And I guess, sometimes I feel like, it's just a matter of taking a bit of a left turn if you've just played. Like I have one piece which is the bridge is quite sentimental, but the rest of it's very static, and I feel like
there's a balance there.
Yeah, over time it sort of evens out, But it's also where my compass is in terms of sentimentality and stuff too. Like, everyone has to make that. You have to make the artist has to make the music they feel is authentic. I mean, they don't have to do that. They may approach it purely as a business thing too. But hopefully the artist makes something that's authentic and the listener finds the music they like and everyone's happy.
Well, I want to ask you a bit about how you make this music. But first, I want to get into so as we're both kind of getting into these forays of new genres of music or subgenres, you were just saying that you were about to travel and it was canceled because of this coronavirus stuff going on. You were going to be, I read about the showcase you were going to do at South by Southwest. It looked good. I'm sorry that.
Yeah, I reckon it would have been nice. I mean, I'm often a bit skeptical about these kind of conferencey things. I mean, actually one of the best things is probably that you do learn how to have an elevator pitch of your own music. But
right.
Beyond that, I feel like unless you're already blowing up huge, like there's just so many bands. I've done a few of those kind of things.
I know, it's true.
Which nothing really came of.
One of the first things I ever did was I played South by in 2014. It was really like the first year I was getting out, and I could not have been a smaller artist. It's like it's kind of a fluke that they asked me to come play. It really was a total fluke, and I was just like, okay. And but I remember it just being like a sea of 50, 60,000 people and noise just everywhere, and I was just trying to I didn't even. But
I was talking
good
to a
on
friend
you
yesterday.
for making it happen. What's that?
I was talking to a friend about it yesterday he's like, it was just like New Year's Eve. Like insanity, but for a bunch of days.
Yeah, it's sort of like Mardi Gras or something.
Yeah.
That's what it felt like. But I was curious, just if I'm sure you've thought about this, it's sort of like the trends or the future of where this is going. This not just like music itself and how it's being ingested, which I like to think about a lot from a technological standpoint, but even like the trends of in some ways, I think that the popularity of contemporary classical music or music that's emotional but not sentimental is a symptom of the coronavirus, the world we live in, the chaos, people looking for solace.
That's a common thought, and I think there's probably a lot of truth in it. It's interesting too. A friend of mine remarked the other day that this kind of aesthetic is almost becoming a little bit too popular, or at least a bit too much of a thing, that it's like now a kind of a trailing indicator rather than a leading indicator kind of thing. And you have to think about what you're going to do. That's what's next. I mean, I think as an artist, you always want to think about that. Otherwise, you just get in a loop of remaking the last album you did with slightly different tunes.
Yeah, you want to be inspired, but I suppose you'll just do what you do, and I'm sure people will resonate. If you make good music, it's good music.
I think ultimately that's the thing. I mean, I'm trying to think of some more conceptual stuff for my next record, but which is we can talk about a bit later too. But at the end of the day, it's music, right? It's like the most honest thing I can do is just sit down and actually try and write some music,
Well, where does it start for you? So what's the process, or is there a different process for, making your music? Does it start from a common core of a piano?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying with this record, the next record, to have some more conceptual frameworks as if I was writing music for a film, because I haven't really done that before, unless it actually is film music. But historically, I kind of just, sat down at the piano, had a bit of a play, recorded it maybe, or had some manuscript paper, and then that was the genesis of it. And I think that's a pretty natural thing if your background is as an improviser.
Right.
That's kind of I don't have a formal. I mean, I don't really know how to sit down away from the instrument with a piece of manuscript paper and write it out.
Yeah, I can't imagine.
In my head. I mean, it could be done, but I don't think it would be as interesting, because there's a lot that comes from the musical choices that are made by the unconscious mind, whilst as an improviser, that I think I can't really beat that if I do it purely with the conscious mind.
Do you have a particular process to access that unconscious mind as a way, like when you're actually improvising? Even it could be a music nerdy thing, but it also could be more of just I don't know, an approach you have emotionally.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Sometimes being distracted can be good. I've noticed a lot of interesting ideas I've come up with have been in sound checks before, like someone else's gig, and you're just kind of noodling around, and then I'm like, hang on a second, I'm going to turn the voice recorder on because that's some interesting ideas there because you're just completely distracted. Other places
turns off a particular part of your brain.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the self-critical part, and or similarly, if you're in a kind of in an emotional state that, I mean, you don't want to obviously, you don't want to force yourself to be sad, but if you're in a emotionally vulnerable state that kind of, again, sort of switches off that, it kind of depletes you of the energy to have that conscious, that voice in your head that's assessing everything you do, then I feel that can also be it can be a good way to get to that place as well.
Did you hear Keith Jarrett's story about the Cologne concert?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that was sheer exhaustion.
Classic.
Right?
Yeah, everything was bad.
Everything was bad. The piano. There's a really cool podcast about that. I think there's a couple
I just
of podcasts.
heard that. It's so good.
I mean, that's the classic story. I remember one of my lecturers at uni talked about this concept of nothing to gain, nothing to lose. And I think another way to get to that place, particularly with performing, is just to do so much of it that you don't. You approach the performance with no expectations. And it's one of those paradoxes, right? You can't actually force yourself to approach it with no expectations because that already is an expectation. You kind of have to you just have to have played so much music that you turn up to the gig and you actually honestly don't care whether it's good or bad, which doesn't mean you don't care about the music, but you've released yourself from expectation. And if you can get to that
that's a tough
place
to get to, man. That's hard. That's tough.
Yeah, you can only do it by, I think my theory is you can only do that through sheer just doing it a lot. And I feel that's why all the great bands, all the Keith solo concerts or Miles Davis or those guys are just playing all the time, and that helps you get to that point where you can turn it on like a tap because it's a language. Talking to you, I'm not thinking about every word that I'm going to say. If I started to do that, I'd probably become mute, right? So music's got to be like that, but you have to kind of be doing it. I think you almost have to do it past the point of exhaustion. Isn't there a story? Is it Art Blakey? There's a story where he told he would force the sax player to play or whoever the horn player was to just play, or maybe it was Ornette Coleman, I can't remember, just to play so much, play 20 choruses. I mean, that's not everyone's idea of fun, but so they almost just blow out all of their idiomatic kind of practiced ideas. Once they were exhausted, then the music would start.
Yeah, that's. I suppose that's one way to do it. And then,
I mean, maybe the audience doesn't want to come on that journey with you.
What's it like for you in private, though, when it's in that improvisational space where you are looking for ideas and you're at the genesis of a beginning, but you need to get out of the way? Is there a way you do that?
Yeah, that is. I mean, I feel then you kind of need to have limits in terms of deadlines or some kind of other parameters that can just help you get started because that would probably explain why in the last year I don't know if I've actually written any music in that way. Like the stuff I've written's either been improvisations I've recorded or music for a film or say things that are more ambient where there's a much more procedural sort of approach of taking some sound and then, that's I also love doing this working in the computer and, taking some sounds and putting them through pulse stretch or, doing that stuff, which is a lot more like problem solving and has a bit less of the magic. It's hopefully still has some magic in it, but it's not coming from that magic place. But usually I just sit down at the piano and it's pretty haphazard, I guess I usually just have a whole Dropbox full of voice memos that I've recorded in those moments where I have felt inspired and then, go idea mining when it's time to collect them into a record.
I heard you once mention something about horizontal harmony as an approach. What did you mean by that? Do you remember that?
Yeah, totally. that's just more of a thing about like approaching everything not purely as counterpoint, because I don't have the skills to like completely, obey all of the rules in real time, but approaching something as if you were improvising a Bach chorale, and to have everything make sense voice leading wise, and avoid the kind of what we talk about in the jazz piano world of the claw, like you've got your left hand configured in this sort of familiar idiomatic voicing, and you just kind of move it around like a guitarist moving their finger up and down the neck. That idea of like always approaching everything so that it makes sense from a voice leading and a kind of harmonically self-consistent point of view. And that was something that was really difficult at the start, because, I mean, it's just hard for your brain to be thinking about like, I better not double the third, or, better put this. I always think of like extensions in chords as having like varying degrees of spiciness. Like, you don't want to have too much. You want to have that. It's not just the question of how many of them you have, but also where you voice them. Like, you can play, if you play, one thing my old jazz teacher showed me is like, because of the way overtones work, like, you can play stuff up high in the piano or in any instrument that's really dissonant and out there, and you won't, and it can actually sound really pleasant, because it's not as, it's more of a like color than
it's got more distance from the chord.
Yeah, I don't know what the actual physics reasons are for it, but I think it might also be because those notes kind of are more congruent with like the overtones of the chords you're playing down below. But if you play like a kind of crunchy chord down really low, I mean, sure, that has an effect, but it's going to sound a lot more obviously dissonant. So I guess I think about, I try to think without overthinking about all of those things, and also write and playing music that's harmonically, self-consistent. And that was just one of those things I really had to force myself to do. And I did it by playing a lot of jazz standards really slowly when I was in my late teens and early 20s. And I guess it got to a point where I could, improvise. I have that kind of... you
don't have to think about it so much.
That horizontal thing. Yeah, exactly. It was like anything, right? If you want to do something, you can kind of do anything that's hard. You just need to train yourself. And yeah, you just have to do it.
Right, yeah. Well, that's a good lesson to know. Maybe people who play instruments, they kind of know it's like you can learn things. I think that could be forgotten as you get older if you don't have some mechanism to teach yourself that.
Yeah, I mean, apparently our brain doesn't get less plastic. It's just, or maybe it gets a bit less plastic, but it's totally possible to learn new things. It's just that maybe your motivation changes. And also, I think you get better at doing the things that you had learned to do, that it's perhaps harder to motivate yourself to learn something completely new. But it can be done.
What aspects of your life that are non-musical are you into that inform your music life? And that could be like, for me, I don't know, my quote-unquote spiritual life, like my feeling of just connection to the world and life is intimately connected to my music world and my music life, and how I like to express music and why I do it and what I'm looking for in the music and kind of what I'm chasing when I'm making it. But it also could be like, I also really like to do construction. I like to build stuff, like carpentry.
That's so common in the music world. The number of engineers and musicians I know that are into carpentry, it's a decent percentage,
Really? I like it because it's where I just like working with wood, but it uses the analytical part of your brain, kind of like music does, and it also uses the creative part of my brain. It's all like numbers, but I'm always problem solving at the same time. So it's very similar to playing music. It's like both sides of my brain are having to function, and obviously it's very physical, which is the best and worst part about it. But
absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think
very rewarding.
The problem-solving part is something I've remarked on a lot before, as having spent a lot of my life running software, which is it's almost entirely about problem-solving, even if the problem is one that you've created just out of thin air for interest's sake. Whereas music's a lot less about that. I mean, it can be, some aspects of it, like production and arranging can be, but a lot of it is purely creative. And there's this whole thing about, this is just one of my pet theories about how the brain's reward system works and how it's a lot easier to engage, or it's more addictive to engage with problem-solving oriented activities because it gets your brain's dopamine system hooked on it, Whereas music, I can spend all the time procrastinating because I haven't got into that I haven't found a way to enter into that flow state where you're like, I just do this and then I do this. And whereas with software, like you just get there immediately. And I imagine with carpentry as well, because like you're going to build something and, you have to do these things and then suddenly it's 3 a.m.
Right. So do you still mess around with software, or do you do things where you're like working in Max MSP or something to create music tools? I mean, does that enter into your music world at all?
Not really. I always kept them pretty separate, and I think I maybe exhausted myself so much with programming that I never really had. I mean, I know what Max MSP is, but I never really had the desire to explore that in the music world. So while I do use, obviously I use technology in making music, but it's very much in a kind of end user sense rather than a programming one. I still do a little bit of programming, but it's kind of, a couple of weeks a year to keep my feet wet and earn a little bit of money. But yeah, I kind of made a decision to switch to music full time with all that entails. But I really do miss the problem solving aspect of the software thing, though. I think just because it's very satisfying. Like your brain gives you a lot of nice chemicals when you get some stuff done and working, and I might get that feeling at the end of a record, but that's a fleeting feeling for a lot of work.
Right. Like I know when you make a record, it's very much about the process. I was just thinking about this the other day because I'm sort of in that space of just sort of trying to make new things and not knowing where it's going to go.
Getting a bit toasty in here.
I'm not sure if I lost you.
Hang on. Hey, you there?
There you are.
Sorry, I think
I
took the laptop with me to turn the aircon on and unplugged it. So you were saying...
Yeah, I said I'm in that new space of when you're making new things, and I don't know, you don't even know where it's very, very, very new. You don't even know where it's going to go, and you're just sort of beginning. And it's important to have. I'm finding like maybe I'm forgetting this, but it's important to have some kind of limitations, like you're saying, because otherwise I just feel like I'm floating. And in some ways, the best things I've done were done where it's like I'm only going to use a piano. In this piano over here, I've been just messing around trying to, find the genesis of the beginnings of something new. And sometimes it just stays like as a piano song. Like you make a little improvisation. You're like, I think that's all it needs. And sometimes it's like, I'm going to take all that stuff out and sort of replace it with other instruments, be that strings or electronics. And maybe the piano's gone or replaced.
Yeah, that's exactly my process.
Yes, all right. Yeah, I'm doing something right.
So, I mean, with Open Heart Story, I had a bunch of, I don't know if I really planned it, but I had a bunch of piano improvisations. I went to a studio to record them because I did want a bit of that, although I have an upright piano at my place, I wanted a bit of the kind of structure. Again, it's this sort of thing of turning into a bit more of a problem-solving thing, creating some parameters. So a day in a studio in Berlin, a few hours to play, and some ideas, even though they were all really just the genesis of ideas that I'd written on a sheet of paper. So there was nothing actually written out properly, but recorded a bunch of stuff. A lot of it wasn't great. If you're playing the piano for 4 or 5 hours, by the time, your best ideas may not be in the last hour, although they could be. And funnily enough, I made a record called More Heart Stories, which was a lot of the stuff that was from that session, which on my first listen back, I just didn't think was good enough, but I didn't have enough distance from it to kind of assess it properly. Anyway, so it's a bunch of piano stuff, but there are pieces like Him and I Still Dream About You, sometimes, but not always, where, I just transcribed it by hand or on the computer, but I mean, I was playing each bar on repeat, trying to figure out what I played. And then I kind of just expanded that vertically into a string arrangement, and although there was some care to make sure it worked well from a harmonic, voice leading perspective, and that you don't have that classic piano player string arranging thing of it being very vertical and, just lots of block chords. But looping back to what we said before, that's one of those things where having that more horizontal approach whilst improvising kind of does a lot of the arranging work for you for free because you have those inner voices, some of those inner voices, and you can just kind of, just give that thing to the viola or something. And, it makes, sure, it may not be the greatest string arrangement, but it's at least a good starting point. And then I'm in that sort of chiseling kind of world where you got the stone or what, you're just trying to, it's actually quite exciting and it leads you to a solution. I think that's what the problem solving thing is about. It's like, does the music lead you to the solution where you get to a point where you're like, I've changed something and then I want to change it back again because I wouldn't use the word perfect, but it's got to the point where there's nothing left to improve with that particular path that you've taken. And that's very satisfying. It's a more satisfying because it is like problem solving than just sitting down at the piano can be like having a bunch of, unfinished ideas. Of course, coming up with something new is also incredibly exciting because, you've brought into the universe some music that didn't exist before, and where does it come from? My dad's always like, where do you get the ideas from? And, okay, sure, I might have stolen the odd arpeggio from the minimalist canon, but although I'm pretty sure Mozart and Beethoven were using them. But where it comes from is a mystical and magical question.
Yeah. I feel like that process, that problem solving you're talking about is where you create an idea and then you start to change it, and then you have to sit there as the witness to say, like, wait a minute, is that better or worse? Like, does that serve the song?
Totally.
And that's where, that's really your role in a way. Like you're saying, where do the ideas come from? I don't know. But your role absolutely is to have that taste, that discernment to say, how can I bring this into form that would make it best? And I think that's probably the freedom of making your own music where you can really do that. As opposed to where you're making a film, you're going to be like, well, look, I have to serve the film and it needs to have a big build here, right? Versus, no, this one is asking for, really, you mentioned we're listening to the Peter Broderick podcast, and I was thinking about Peter the other day, how he was saying like, I just did this remix and it came out as like a hip hop track, and I that's just where it went. It's like, good on you, man. Like, but I think that's kind of what you're talking about, isn't it? It's like that process of making a song is sort of like being in this seat where you're watching it. You're trying to serve it by you put on different clothes to it. And you're like, yes, no. Now what does it need? Does it need a hat? I don't know. The shoes aren't right.
Yeah.
It's fun that way.
That's a really beautiful way of describing it. And I think if you can actually get to that place of witnessing it as a third party, then you're in the perfect egoless place in order to make those kind of artistic and aesthetic assessments. Of course, that can be hard to do. Particularly, a classic example might be, like you spend all this money on recording some stuff somewhere, and you're like, I have to use this overdub or this bit or this string piece, even though I don't know if it really works artistically because, I put all that time and money into it. And that's where distance, the easiest way to get to that witness place is to have time and space away from the initial. And of course, that's often not practical because you're either you're trying to finish an album within a certain release cycle, and so you either need people you trust or around you that can help, or you just have to create little. A good thing is, of course, just to work on something and then have a few weeks on a different project. But
that's the best. Yeah, having time. This is my biggest nightmare is okay, you have to just do it and not be able to sleep on it and just release it. That would be really hard. Although I did that today. Although not with music, I just did a meditation and all this Corona stuff. And I was like, I just want to make one right now. And I did it in one take, and then I just hit release. Did a quick mix. Oh yeah, one take can be. My favorite records that I've made have been made real quick, in that kind of old school jazz way. And I thought about it, why I like them. Obviously, a big part of it is the spontaneity and that sort of detachment or lack of attachment that comes from the process. But also, I think it's simply that if you make something quickly, you don't have a lot of time for the expectations to kind of ferment, and so you're not in that position where you're kind of trying to reconcile your intention and then the outcome. I think a lot of the reasons we have trouble working on music that's straight after, say, we've recorded it, for example, is that we're still hearing our intention
And it's frustrating when inevitably the intention's not completely manifest. Whereas if you have some space from it, you can't actually remember what your intention was half the time, particularly if it's improvised, and you're like, oh yeah, that's kind of okay.
Your unrequited love dies down in a way. It's desires.
Yeah, because often you got these intentions and expectations that are like really high, and that's great because you want to shoot for what's that thing like? It doesn't hurt to shoot for aim for the stars because you might at least get to the moon, or the other way around. That stuff's good, but you also have to be able to assess the music that you make in a kind of detached way of like, hey, this may not be what I want it to be, but it is the music I'm making now, and I have to accept it, and learn from it, and otherwise you'd never get around to releasing anything if you're a self-critical person with high expectations.
Doesn't that happen all the time? I love that idea. You said this is the music that I'm making. It's like this is what's emerging. You know what I mean? This is the music being made. Do I want to fight it or do I want to serve it? And it might not have been my original vision. As a matter of fact, I don't know if it ever has been. Like I always have an idea, and then it starts going somewhere, and I'm like, okay, well, this is it.
Because the thing is, you learn so much from finishing something too, right? Yeah. Like if you're a classic, idea abandoner, I mean, obviously, whatever floats your boat, but if you have a whole lot of unfinished ideas, you never learn what happens from actually seeing an idea through to its conclusion, which might be right to the end of actually, mixing and mastering a record and doing the artwork and getting it pressed and all that stuff. And those are great skills, particularly if you don't have someone else to do them for you. They're skills that you need to have, and you only learn them by doing them. I mean, it's that sort of showing up, that kind of Nick Cave, like showing up to work 9 to 5 kind of approach to music making, which I like. Sure, you may not do something creative every day, but you'll do a great deal more than if you are like procrastinating all the time and waiting for that moment when the muse strikes, because at that point you won't actually have the skills to realize it.
Do you go to a place? Is that place you're in now like a studio, or is that your home, or both?
No, it's the studio, and although I haven't had it for too long, but it's like going to work. I mean, if I'm going to be confined to home for the next few weeks, Corona-wise, then I might have to set up my home studio again. But it's good having a place. Not that I don't get distracted and procrastinate, but it's a lot more obvious when you're doing that in a place that's purpose-built as a studio than it is when you're at home and you can have a nap or raid the fridge or whatever.
Yeah. So tell me about the space you're in. I just want a few quick questions about what it's like there, and even just like some gear that you might be using. Yeah, no, because you do a lot, of piano. Do you have a piano there?
I do, but it's just my upright. It's like a Yamaha upright I've had for years. It's good, and I've used it on a bunch of recordings, but I kind of prefer... there are other pianos I like the sound of, and certainly it's never going to sound like a grand piano. And as I was saying before, I do kind of like the stress that comes from going to a studio, with a nice piano and having to get the things done in the day, because it forces you to prepare, and it also gives you a limited set of choices. Like you're not going to have 24 hours of piano noodling to sort through if you've just gone and booked a day session somewhere. So I use my piano here more just for, at the moment, really just for ideas and for practicing. And it's not set up to record right now. Like I'd have to take a whole lot of stuff off the top of it to do any recording. But other than that, I have just a really beautiful light-filled space. It's about 30 square meters.
Nice.
You but not your listeners can see that I have this crazy kind of lattice stuff in the ceiling. Just so it's finally been finished with all of the treatment and stuff. But really, it's just a nice room with a computer in it, really, or a screen in it. My computer's in another room, and some beautiful speakers. And I don't use I have a bit of gear, outboard gear, but I don't really use much of it.
What kind of mics do you like on your piano?
Mostly in the bottom. Again, I feel like there's sort of no rocket science in this. I have a couple of, small diaphragm condensers. They're Sherps, but they could easily be, Neumanns or it's kind of thing. Like when I recorded at Rainbow Studio a bunch of times with a sadly recently departed Jano Kongshog. He's an incredible engineer. And when I went there, I was like, it's not like he's got some kind of magic microphone or all of those things were like just the sum is better than the parts or whatever the expression is. Like great instrument, great room, great mics. It all sort of adds up. But there's no kind of like, I'm not like a gear collector and have some kind of magic sort of something that I rescued from a German broadcaster in the 70s or something, in part because that becomes a whole career and hobby in itself. Yeah. And also that gear is easier to find if you live in Berlin, right? It's probably easier for like your Peter Broderick or Niels or stuff there. They know when the auctions are, but we tend to have to look on eBay and pay through the nose for that kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah, well, it looks like a really beautiful space.
So it's all fairly, yeah, I'm into the like... Also, switching between projects, working in the box is really useful because you don't have to worry about recalling stuff and gear. And I also I built the studio. I kind of exhausted my budget for buying toys. So yeah, I do have a Space Echo because it's it's kind of nice, and it's nice to. I stole this trick from Oliver of like printing reverbs through Space Echo.
Yeah, you have two of them. You do it in
stereo.
If I can
be bothered, that's. I don't have two of them like he does, so I have to do it one channel at a time. But at least I can say they're perfectly matched that way. It just takes me twice as long. And some nice preamps, some Crane Song gear, and thermionic culture and stuff. But it's a tool.
Yeah.
I'm not like. You're not going to find a wall of synths. I don't have a CS80 or a Mini Moog or any of that sort of stuff.
Cool.
I think the plugins... Also, I feel like we're getting to a point where plugins are so good.
They are quite good. Yeah, it's incredible. Well, the last kind of realm I wanted to ask you about was, we were beginning this conversation kind of talking about simplicity and limitations. And we were talking about as a mode of like emotion versus sentimentality. How does your music and those qualities that are in it, how is that reflected in your life? Or is it? Or do you see it that way?
That's a really beautiful question because I often feel my own nature is almost diametrically opposed to the music I make. Like I'm pretty scatty, drink a lot of coffee, kind of like talkative, always interrupting people. Mm-hmm. It's almost that I have to work really hard to create a place in music that is that's almost contrasting to my nature. But I also feel playing the piano is actually the time I get. It's the time I find it a lot easier to get to that sort of alpha sort of state of a meditative state than I do if I try to do yoga or meditate. Mostly because I haven't practiced those things enough.
Me too.
But playing music is something I've been doing for so long that I can access that spot like almost instantaneously, particularly in a performance because, you're kind of being held accountable by the audience to play and you can't just get off the piano and check Instagram. But, I'm as addicted, I have all the modern foibles like as anyone else. But maybe it's like I have... the whole idea of like using energy to decrease the amount of entropy in the universe kind of thing. Like I have to work hard to create simplicity in the music. And as I said before, like it took me years to kind of exhaust the overplaying jazz kind of thing. I mean, if I listen to me playing music when I was in my early 20s, like totally more technique than taste. Like as one of my old teachers used to say, just take your hands off the keyboard for like, or take the saxophone out of your mouth. Like just stop for a while, and that's a classic piano player problem too. We don't have that.
Got 10 fingers.
We're not physiologically limited. We can play we can play like the whole night long and not get exhausted.
Yeah, that's a beautiful answer. I find a lot of similarities for myself in that the music and the process of making it is like its own kind of medicine for my own chaos and just activity in my life. Totally. And it's a kind of the process of making it is a discipline for me that if I didn't do it, like if I didn't have this job and career, I'm most grateful for it because it forces me to do it. And then I am able to keep myself a little more sane by just creating, and creating something.
I agree. And I think there's a couple of things. One is engaging with music, whether to some degree, whether it's as a performer or a writer, is something I've been doing since I was 4.5. So there's so much kind of there's a lot of sort of like a ritual. There's like a memory in yourself of that, and so it's a very comfortable place to go to. And when I was doing like only programming, I kind of missed it, in part because it's a big part of your identity and ego, and maybe that's not the positive side of it, but also it's part of it's just something you're so used to doing. It's a very, and I know this is going to sound maybe a little bit cheesy, but particularly in this kind of, it's a pretty, right now in Melbourne where like two of my friends turned up at the supermarket at 6:30. Well, one of them was my mum, and another friend turned up at the supermarket at 6:30, and there's a queue and no toilet paper. It's a pretty crazy time right now, and music is like, it is a bit of a safe place to go to. And another thing that my friend Tim Scheel, is a great musician and great person, says is like, whenever you're stuck, and it could be because your career is not happening at the trajectory or rate that you want it to, whatever, like, the one thing you can do is that's completely in your control is to go and make some music. You can't control, you've got no agency over whether, anyone's going to listen to it or whether it ends up on a Spotify playlist or whatever, but you can make music. And there's a lot of the humans, things that we are out of our control make us uncomfortable. Things that we can do, have agency over, make us feel a lot better, right? Like, it's so, you don't actually need anything to make. You need very little to make music, and that's a really nice thing to do.
Well, we're both so lucky. I feel fortunate.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
That's awesome, man. Well, thank you so much for spending a little time just so we can get into your own head and into your world. It's fun for me because I've enjoyed your music from afar.
Thank you.
And this podcast is a great excuse for me just to like reach out and get to learn about the humanity behind the creative ideas. And it's also just great to meet you. So thank you.
You too. I hope we meet in person. And I mean, I feel like we could easily talk for 8. There's so much stuff we didn't even talk about. We'll have to do it again sometime. But
I'd love to.
It's really got me thinking about how to articulate some of these feelings and ideas. So thank you so much.
We'll definitely do it again. And I'll put a link to your music, of course, in the show notes. But people can find Luke Howard wherever they listen to music. And I hope to see you come to the States to play a show. I'll do what I can. If you need a visa, we'll hook you up. We'll figure it out.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Cheers.
Thanks so much, Luke, for giving me the time all the way from Australia. It's wonderful to chat with you, and please check out his music. You will be grateful that you did. And thanks again for giving all the reviews. Stay tuned for a new release coming out on July 17th with Born Eye. Born Eye is a DC-based hip-hop artist that does some meditation work and teaching, and he and I collaborated, and I remixed a track of his called I Can't Breathe that's coming out on all platforms on July 17th. And yeah, this song you hear in the background is called Limitations. It's from the East Forest album Orbits. We've got an update probably next week about the East Forest retreat in the fall, whether it's postponed or not, until when. So if you want to know about that, stay tuned. Otherwise, you guys, listen, keep walking your walk. God knows it's harder than it usually is. But when you take any shit, if you do take some shit, do it with grace.